Good evening, everybody. My name is Lauren De Jesus, and I am the Civic Engagement Educator at the UIC Latino Cultural Center. Thank you for joining us for today's Climates of Inequality program. Before we get started, there are a few things to keep in mind. First, we wanted to do a quick access check. Please let us know if our audio is okay. Let us know in the chat if you're an attendee. Give you all a second. And also, let us know if you're able to access the live caption by clicking more and show subtitle at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you have any questions about accessibility during our program, please message us and we will guide you through that process. Also, this program will be recorded on Zoom, so you would have to accept the prompt. As always, please be mindful of the virtual space. Use the chat for comments or questions, and we'll try to get to them towards the end of the program. Now we're going to switch screens a little bit. And in the spirit of healing, we would like to acknowledge and honor the original peoples of the Chicagoland area, the Three Fires Confederacy, including the Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwe nations, as well as other tribal nations that know this area as their ancestral homeland, including the Menominee, Ho-Chunk, Miami, Peoria, and Sauk and Fox. Further, we recognize that indigenous peoples are the traditional stewards of the land that we now occupy, and acknowledge that this land is the current home to one of the largest urban Native American communities in the United States. Native people are part of Chicago's past, present, and future. And finally, we would like to understand that to acknowledge is to act. And we encourage everyone to consider the multitude of ways to translate knowledge and thoughts into active support for indigenous peoples and communities locally, nationally, and around the world. Again, thank you for joining us today. I will now pass the virtual mic to our Center Director, Dr. Rosa Cabrera.
Thank you, Lauren. And I should say good early evening and welcome everyone. I am Rosa Cabrera, Director of the UIC Rafael Cintron Ortiz Latino Cultural Center, better known as the LCC. Thank you for joining us in this virtual space for our Climates of Inequality program. We're delighted to present the third season of Climates of Inequality, highlighting local, national, and international leaders working on environmental and climate justice. This guest speaker have been sharing frameworks and solutions to address the disproportionate impacts of climate change and environmental pollution on communities of color, indigenous, Blacks, low-income earners, and including women, the very old and young, the LGBTQ, disabled, and undocumented communities. You will be able to find the previous presentation videos in the LCC website, which I believe someone will be putting the link in the chat soon. Before we start the presentation, a few shout outs of appreciation are in order. We can start with our partners, the Humanities Action Lab, where Climates of Inequality project resides, and organizations Alianza Americas and Little Village Environmental Justice Organization, known as Elvejo, for their continuous collaboration with the LCC. To our co-sponsors, the UIC Sustainability Fee, Latin American and Latino Studies, Social Justice Initiative, the Department of Anthropology, CIMAS Project, Freshwater Lab, Great Cities Institute, Las Ganas Project, Museums and Exhibition Studies, and Native American Support Program. And also to the student panelists in my environmental and climate justice class. They are Sekaira McKee, Ali Ephraim, Sebastian Villa, Natalie Ayala, and Caitlin Payton. The presentation will be about 30 minutes long, followed by a short conversation between these students and our guest speaker. Today's presentation will focus on the wisdom of people from the First Nation and their indigenous teaching about water and our relationship and responsibility to it. Clean water has become an increasingly scarce resource around the world and country, with the most recent publicly known crisis in Jackson, Mississippi. This has been prompted by years of failure to fix a deteriorating water infrastructure that has left residents of the majority Black city of Jackson without safe drinking water. While people around the Great Lakes, like all of us, are blessed with abundance of water, protecting and restoring our water has been a long tradition of indigenous people who are the original caretakers of the lands and waters that sustain our lives. Today, we're fortunate to hear from the wisdom voice of Frank Edawashki, Executive Director of the United Tribes of Michigan, who will talk about the adoption of the Tribal and First Nations Great Lakes Water Accord and his environmental justice work with the Great Lakes. I would like to give you a bit of background on Frank. He lives in Harbor Springs, Michigan, with his wife, Rochelle, and served in tribal elected office for 16 years, 14 as the tribal chairman of the Little Traverse Bay Bands of Odawa Indians in Harbor Springs, Michigan. During his tenure as tribal chairman, he was instrumental in the adoption of the Tribal and First Nations Great Lakes Water Accord in 2004 and the United League of Indigenous Nations Treaty in 2007. Recently, he was appointed Tribal Core Appellate Justice for his tribe and has represented the National Congress of American Indians at several meetings of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change from 2015 to 2021, the latest being held in Scotland. Frank is a lecturer and teacher on environmental issues, indigenous nations issues, stoneware and Indian pottery, Indian culture and storytelling. He held the position of 2010 Fellow at the Native Nations Institute Indigenous Leaders Fellowship Program at the University of Arizona. Frank spent years reviving the making of the traditional Indian pottery of the Great Lakes area, and his pottery is in public and private collections throughout the world. Frank is also a storyteller who learned his tradition from his father, Fred, who was a well-known storyteller throughout Michigan. Now, please join me in welcoming Frank.
Thank you, Rosa. I appreciate that introduction. Ani, pipigwa ododem, waganakasing adonjaba, nakwe gijik, indijnakas. Ani is hello. Pipigwa ododem, that's the sparrowhawk is the mark of my family. Waganakasing adonjaba, I mean, it's where I'm from the land of the crooked tree, and my Indian name, nakwe gijik. Nakwagijik, noonday. That's my name in Indian. Although on my driver's license, I'm Frank Edawagishik. So I carry several different names, as many of us do. I appreciate the opportunity to be speaking to you today. I know that many of the things that I've done, as you've heard in this introduction, I've been involved in tribal issues, the United Tribes of Michigan. I'm the executive director. Been involved with the International Indian Treaty Council and the National Congress of American Indians. I've worked with the state of Michigan on the Water Use Advisory Council. I'm also was on the Environmental Justice Work Group for the former Governor Snyder. There's numerous other things that I've done that deal with water, including things with the United Nations, with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, for instance, and with the World Intellectual Properties Organization and the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. One of the other things I do that's international is I work on the Great Lakes Water Quality Board, which is a board that serves under the International Joint Commission. That's between Canada and the United States. And that was created by the 1909 Boundary Waters Treaty. that creates a 6-member commission to deal with water issues between the United States and Canada. The Water Quality Board has done and looks to the future for future risks, looks to what currently has to be done to clean up things from the past. And it's a body that gives advice to the Joint Commission, who then advises the two governments of Canada and the United States. When we, one of the questions that I ask myself is, when will we be able to drink from our lakes and streams? The International Joint Commission has a goal, for instance. They say that they're working to make sure that the Great Lakes are drinkable, fishable, and swimmable. All of these are sort of the same kind of thing. These are the kind of things that we're looking at to keep the waters pure. Environmental justice and climate justice, we often think of these in human terms. You know, how is the justice, the inequality in climate justice, how is that taken in human populations? But a really important thing that we think about from the Native point of view is that there are many populations that suffer from the injustice of human actions. These populations include the birds that navigate their migrations by the stars. They include, you know, the fish living in the waters, and all of the other beings that we share the world with. They can be affected by light pollution. They can be affected by other types of things that are in the environment. And so when we think of environmental justice, it's helpful for us to think about that in a broader sense, not just the human population, but how that affects all of those other populations that are part of this natural world that we share. We're taught to think about in native cultures the concept of balance, the concept of we have 4 direction teachings, and we think about that as the East, which is represented by dawn, and that's infancy, and it's that time of coming into the world, you know, with fresh eyes. We believe that those young ones that come into this world are close to that spirit world. They can see both worlds. And each one of us at one point had that same look, had that same wonder in our eyes when we came into this world. And we try to ask people to remember that feeling, to try to remember that as best we can as we go through our lives. We also think about that southern direction representing youth and summer, that time when there's, we're testing, we're learning, we're out making mistakes, learning how to fall out of trees, for instance, and things of this sort. But we're testing the world and each other and our parents, for instance, and we're out there finding our limits and understanding things in the world. That time of youth, that's summer. And then we think about that western direction, that direction of autumn, that's middle age. That's when we're working and we have jobs, we're keeping a home, we're putting food on the table and providing shelter, and thinking about how we protect these infants and the youth in their homes and help them to do their duties and to live their lives through that time period. But in that western direction, that's what we're doing there. And then we think about that northern direction, that direction of winter, of old age, of storytelling and wisdom, that time when we're passing on the stories to the other generations, and we're helping to provide that bridge, because as the elders from that northern direction reach out and touch the fingers of those infants coming in, it completes that circle. And that circle goes on and on and on into the future. And that's what we work for. And we think about that circle as it's come up to us this point, but also how it goes ahead of us. So we think about balance between these teachings and these directions, but they also include, those 4 directions include earth, fire, wind, and water. They include the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. There's teachings that go in each of these 4 directions. And the idea is to achieve balance. The idea is to not be too far in any one of these directions, to be too involved physically, for instance, at the expense of mentally and spiritually, or too involved spiritually at the expense of the others. And the idea is to try to be balanced in everything and to achieve that. And that's an important part of it, because for us, when we look at the environment, a good deal of the problems that we're facing are because of imbalance, because we've done too much of one thing or another in it as cultures across the world. And that has led to this imbalance. It's led to us not being able to achieve that harmony that comes from being in balance. The other thing we have are we have 7 grandfather teachings. And in those 7 grandfather teachings, there's love and humility and respect, a number of others, but respect is the one that I usually talk about, because that idea of respect, if you're respecting not just yourself and your family, and other human beings, but if you're respecting the natural world, then when you do things that show less respect, there's a lack of respect or no respect, as it may be, what happens is that causes actions. You may justify doing things that otherwise you would know were harmful, but you're just not going to respect those. You're not going to respect a river, for instance, and so you're willing to pollute it, or you're not going to respect the need of the beings for darkness, so you're going to put lots of light pollution in the air, because you're going to mess with all those creatures that have learned over the millennia to live in those cycles of light and dark. And when we change those cycles on them, it changes them. And so we have to respect is really important, and lack of respect is what's got us into this situation that we're in. We also think about 7 generations, and this is something that we're to consider the consequences of our actions through a time period long enough to encompass 7 generations. So you think about that, that's long enough that most of us don't know 7 generations ago. We can think of it, it's more than likely those 7 generations from now may not know our names. But what are we doing to help for things that they are going to have? And so we're thinking about what will they be thinking about us, but the other one is each one of us is somebody's 7th generation. What did our ancestors do that caused us to be where we are today? For instance, right in this very class right now, in this very together in this group of us, what caused us to be here? Where did they move? How did they live? What kind of thoughts did they have? What actions did they take that caused us to be where we are today? And so we think about that, but then we have to think about what are we doing for those coming generations as well, for those ones that are going to come following us. So when my ancestors years ago were signing treaties, one of the things we reserved, for instance, we reserved treaty rights. In those treaty rights, one of them is fishing. And the courts have a tendency to look at that as being a property right. But when my ancestors signed treaties that reserved fishing rights, they didn't go to the water and say, those out there, those are our fish. Rather, they reserved the right to sing for the fish, to dance for the fish, to pray for the fish, to catch and eat the fish, but to live with the fish, to have a relationship with the fish. In other words, those treaty rights weren't so much property rights as they were relationship rights. The idea that there's this relationship to fish. But when we think about it, you expand that to include, we have a relationship with Mother Earth. We have a relationship with the medicine plants that help heal us. We have a relationship with the food plants that feed us and that we plant. They need us. Corn needs us to plant it, but it feeds us. So that we have this reciprocal relationship with corn, for instance, and all of these other things that are out there. It's these relationships that are important. And so we think about that as what does it mean when we have those relationships? It means that we are all interconnected. When you hear sometimes that phrase that you hear from some of the Lakota where they say, all my relatives, Well, that's basically what they're saying, is that all my relatives includes all of the world. Those relatives include not only the living beings that are in the world that we share this world with, but they also include the rocks and the streams, the water, all of the air itself, the view of the night sky, all of those things are our relatives. And so that relationship, when you think of yourself as having a relationship rather than ownership, it makes a really big difference in the way you approach climate. This, you know, I think about what happens and some examples that we have of what happens when we don't show this respect in the natural world, when our societies as a whole start doing things like, and I've got a list here of stuff that I wrote down, but one of the things that struck me is we were working on an agreement with the Great Lakes, and the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, were writing about things that they were doing that were affected by climate and by particularly water, and it's related to the environment. And the women there would always make baskets, and they would take reeds. They'd collect the reeds, they'd soak them, and then as they were weaving them, they'd run them between their lips like this to get them moist enough that they would then work with when they were doing the weaving. And they discovered that they could no longer do this. They could no longer run them between their lips like that because they were getting poisoned from all the chemicals in the water. That's a direct, what that's doing is human actions or inactions, as it may be, were causing pollution to occur that would then affect the ability of those women to have that relationship with those natural beings from the world that they use to make baskets. And that relationship was impaired. Another one we have as an example of my tribe itself, we have a whole list of a little dial that's got all the lakes from our reservation on it, and it's got all the different types of fish. And it gives you advisories of which fish you can eat and how often you can eat them from all the different lakes based on the amount of pollution in those lakes. Some pregnant women of childbearing years are advised to eat fish once a month from some of these places, if at all, because of the potential harm to a fetus that could come from those chemicals in the lakes. And so we have these fish advisories that occur. Those are some of the other examples of that imbalance, that idea of things being not the way they should be. We also have the potential for pollution from around of our farmland because of acid rain, as you've heard it called, but also other chemicals that fall out of the sky that get on the farmland. So nice pristine farmland somewhere, you think of it as not being untouched, and yet there's a potential. We have to pay attention because we not only have to protect the water. You've heard of water protectors protecting water, but we have to protect the air. We have to have sky protectors. We have to have fire protectors to help protect our fires and make sure that they're properly maintained. And when fire gets out of hand, like they are in California on this very moment while we speak, thousands of acres of land is burning because people did not respect and take care of that land in the way they should. And so because of that, there's extraordinary fires going on right now. And so you have, earth, fire, wind, water, all of these things are important that we take care of. Another example of what happens to us, and that's stuff you may have heard of, PFAS or PFOS. PFAS and PFOS are two chemicals of a whole family of chemicals. They're called the forever chemicals. And we found they did wondrous things. We used them in firefighting foam for airplane fires, and the military used it a lot, but also other fire departments would use them. They were on hush puppy shoes to make them waterproof. They're on the wrappers that's put on the wrapper of fast food so that the food doesn't stick to the wrapper. It's in there. It's on Scotch Guard on your carpets and in your furniture and your curtains and these things. And the chemicals never go away. They've only recently discovered that there's a couple of them that they might be able to break down. But for a long time now, they've thought that there was no way to break these chemicals down. They found traces of these chemicals in ice in the Arctic because they go into the air and then they get rained down and as snow. And so these things are things that are causing an imbalance. As part of that imbalance that we have, that idea of how this stuff occurs. So this one particular lake in Michigan, in Oscoda, near Oscoda, the lake is so polluted with the PFAS that the foam on the lake, you're not allowed to, you can't touch the water, you can't touch the foam or anything that touches the foam, you can't let your dog run loose, you can't hunt waterfowl or eat any fish out of the lake, and you can't hunt any deer within like a mile of the lake because it's too polluted, and we can't. And this is a big problem. This is that imbalance. This is that lack of respect. This is the thing that we cause this, how we're dealing with this. So indigenous people, we're bearing a huge load of this because we live so close to the land. And living close to the land, we're exposed to these things more often. And we're also more aware of how interrelated everything is. A lot of folks, there was a sign along the highway coming north out of Lansing, Michigan. For years, it said, "Only farmers grow food." And that's because so many people living in the cities, when they go, they think the food comes from the grocery store. They don't realize food comes from the land. They don't realize that all of this stuff is important for us to this balance we have, and that we're all part of this natural world. And so when that impinges upon us, it gets really important for us to be thinking of. I know that that urban climate and climate justice in urban environments. When I was on Governor Snyder's climate justice work group, one of the things that we worked on was that focused on how so many urban areas have become sacrifice zones. As Naomi Klein says, those sacrifice zones are areas where society as a whole is willing to sacrifice that area and those people that live there for the general betterment of everybody else. Everybody else can live a better life because all the pollutedness is near those factories in the city. But the people who work there live and work in that. And so often the urban poor, and for a large part, those are people of color, natives and Hispanic and Latino. All of these are parts of those populations, and the Blacks. All of this living around in these areas bear the brunt of this inequality that happens in these urban centers. But I wanted to talk about the natural world as a whole first, because it's not just there in that urban environment where climate injustice exists. It exists throughout the entire world. And we all have to realize that the broader picture, because we can't clean up that environment in the urban areas without cleaning up everything else as well. And so those are really important points, I believe, for us to pay attention to. As indigenous peoples, we work to fulfill our sacred duties. And in those sacred duties, a large part of fulfilling those sacred duties is not to interfere with the other beings doing their sacred duties. As an example, a tree grows. It has a sacred duty to help. It cleans the air. It has a relationship with the other trees around it. But it provides wood for our homes, fuel for our fires, and innumerable other things, medicines for us. And that tree, it has a sacred duty to be a tree and to do those things. The fish, they have a sacred duty. And those fish, when they make babies, they make lots of them. They make lots and lots and lots of them. Why? They don't need to make that many in order to survive, but they make that many because they have to feed other fish. They feed the osprey and the eagles and all the other birds that feed on them, the loons, and they feed other animals, and then they feed us. And then they still have to make enough that they can survive that reproduce. So those fish, part of their sacred duty is to do these things. Our sacred duty is to make sure the water is clean for them so that they can continue on doing their sacred duties. As we discover what our sacred duties are, the biggest part of our sacred duty is not to interfere with the sacred duties of those other beings around us. When we're harmed, others are harmed as well. So when we notice that we're having problems, well, by the time we notice we're having problems, a lot of other beings are having problems as well. And so as we work to fix our problems, to fix what's up for us, as we do that type of preparations and repair and do whatever we can to help make up for the times that we've made mistakes, when we do those things, we're also helping other folks as well. So along that line, in 2004, as was in the introduction, you heard about the Tribal and First Nations Great Lakes Water Accord. And I was instrumental in helping to bring that about. We formed a meeting with the tribes and First Nations from Canada. First Nations are what the tribes are called in Canada, and in Ontario and Quebec, and in the 8 Great Lakes states. There's about 185 tribes and First Nations in that area. And the states and provinces were preparing to sign an agreement, a Great Lakes Compact, and an international agreement that would work on protecting the lakes from bulk groundwater withdrawal and from diversions of water from the Great Lakes. But the problem that is the documents that they'd worked out did not take into account treaty rights, did not take into account the rights that the sovereign nations had, the sovereign tribal nations and First Nations had. And so this document was flawed. And we knew that that would be flawed, and we kept trying to get into the discussions, and we couldn't do it. They wouldn't let us in. We tried and tried and tried, and they wouldn't let us in. So we called a meeting of all the tribes and First Nations and said, well, I guess you're going to have to negotiate with us one-on-one now, because we're going to come up with our own plan. And so we did. We prepared this document, and it's an agreement that there's issues in the water. We need to work together, and we needed to work on this. We pledged to work to fulfill our sacred duties. And that part of that fulfillment of the sacred duties was the signing of this accord. And we signed it. And after 2 years of trying to get into the negotiations, within 24 hours of signing the agreement, we were invited to be part of the negotiations. And we were able to fix the parts of the states and provinces documents that were incorrect. And we were able to support the passage of those. And they've now been in effect a number of years. For the states and provinces, the agreement that the states did has actually been tested in court and other places now, and it helps to protect the Great Lakes. But in doing that, the Native participation in that was to fulfill our sacred duties, to help work on keeping harmony out there, keeping things going the way that we felt that they should be going. And, we asked this earlier when I started. I said, when will we be able to drink from our lakes and streams? And as I said, the International Joint Commission was drinkable, fishable, and swimmable. But the idea is, we go back to that concept of 7 generations. We think about what those ancestors did for us and left us, how they got us to this point. And we think about 7 generations from now, what are they going to be thinking about us? And the best that we can hope for is that 7 generations from now, they'll look back at us and consider us to be good ancestors. And with that, I'm completed with this part. We can go on to the questions and answers. I thank you so much for this time.
Thank you so much, Frank. This was incredible. I see folks are clapping and using their emojis to clap as well. With the remainder of our time, I'd like to now invite the student panelists to share any questions and thoughts they have with Frank. Everyone else who's joining us, please feel free to add any thoughts or questions that you may want to share with Frank. via the chat or the Q&A feature. Any of the students, please take it away.
Okay. Hi. Thank you so much for that presentation. My question is, have you seen, and like over the time that you've spent being in all of these positions of relating to other people, an improvement or like states, nations, international people wanting and reaching out to the tribes more now that there is a more wider spread acknowledgement of climate change? Or do you feel like you're still having to force yourself into those conversations? Has there been an improvement?
Well, if you noticed at the beginning of this event, there was a land acknowledgement. 2 years ago, that wouldn't have occurred. Most of the universities, at least in the Midwest, and many universities across the country, are doing similar things now, acknowledging land. The International Joint Commission itself does an acknowledgement before it starts its meetings. Great Lakes Water Quality Board is doing one. And we find that just that by itself is a way of reaching out. It's a way of starting the process to pay attention. The Indigenous Caucus, which is part of the, there's an Indigenous Caucus that's part of almost all of the United Nations different organizations. So at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Indigenous Caucus is made up of those Indigenous people who show up there to work on it. I've been there since 2015 at Paris, and what that caucus started out by not being able to even be in the room where the conversations were occurring, to now actually being able to make statements on the floor. So we're getting an increasing voice in the places that we go, in the same way that we're working on a number of other things. So the answer to this is yes, there is additional things. When we did the, some of you may know about the Waukesha diversion. The Waukesha ask for water from the Great Lakes. And under the agreements that we had, they could use it, but they had to go through a certain process to get there. And the tribes raised several complaints about the manner in which they were originally asking to use that water. The states listened to us, and during the process of listening to the tribes, they realized that the tribal governments were not public. We weren't the Boy Scouts or the Farm Bureau or some matter of the public. Rather, we were governments. And they started treating our input as governmental input. And we, instead of being held to the public comment periods during the whole process for the Waukesha diversion consideration, we actually were negotiating with the state right up to the day before they made the decision. And they ended up using a big part of the input that the tribes had. And then they publicly thanked us for giving that input. These are things that never would have happened 25 years ago. So there is progress. It is it has to be incremental progress, because we also have a long way to go before we get where we're accepted equally in terms of all this. But the answer to your question, the longer answer has been yes. You know, there definitely has been some progress.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, if I can go next. So thank you again, Frank, for your presentation, for being with us. And to go off of Caitlin's point, I know from what you've shared, you have a lot of experience working with different countries. So you had mentioned working obviously in the United States, Canada, I imagine elsewhere as well, speaking about the UN. And so I'm just curious if you're comfortable telling us more about maybe specific countries, so maybe more so like administrations you've worked with, where there has been success, there has been cooperation, and why that was. Kind of like, what did you witness from those administrations where it felt like they were more in support of what you wanted to accomplish?
Well, indigenous people have on any given issue, and we're engaged on virtually every issue. They like to think indigenous issues are one sort of silo, and that when they're dealing with other things, well, that's other stuff. But indigenous issues are all by ourselves. But actually, indigenous issues are part of every single one of these things that they call silos out there. You know, because we're concerned about food security. We're concerned about energy. We're concerned about pollution issues. We're concerned about health, all the health issues. We're concerned about land use and all these different things. So in that respect, we end up with people who are inclined to help us on any one of these given issues who may not be inclined on other issues. Okay. And so the answer to your question is a really complex answer, because there are people who are really supportive on certain things, but are totally not in our corner on others. And so we have to, we're working with people from all over. The United States has been maybe not the most supportive at all times, even though supposedly they represent us as tribes because they're representing us. The Indigenous Caucus, we go there and say, well, this is what we think, and we disagree with what the United States is saying. There's times when we have to do that. Or, for instance, they'll let us take a position that they'd rather take, but they can't take it for political reasons. They let us take it, let us catch all the grief, but then they get the benefit from it. And so, this whole international politics and maneuvering and negotiations is a really complex place. And there's a lot of language. And if you are an impatient person, never go to the United Nations. Because what happens there happens on a generational basis, or at least decadal. It's something that's going to, it takes a long time. In the negotiations for the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it took 10 years to get an S on the word people. Just as one example. And so it's a very long and tedious process, but we have made steady progress. And some of the countries that I can sort of shout out are Mexico. Mexico has been really helpful on a lot of issues. We disagree on some, but they've been very helpful. Norway has been really helpful on a lot of issues. We disagree with them. They're now the leading producer of oil and natural gas in Europe. And we don't agree with that, but we do agree with how they spend their money, because they've been really supportive of indigenous voices and views. We get good support from portions of the EU as a whole. The EU has been helpful in many cases, but they also are made up of a bunch of different countries that don't always agree with each other. And if they have to reach a consensus opinion, they don't always side with us, but we've often met with them and helped them, and they've helped us. We get support from several of the Latin American countries, and South Africa has been supportive for what we've been doing. The way part of that support comes from when they were fighting apartheid. Some of the young leaders that were fighting apartheid would come to the United States, and they got a lot of support. They got a lot of support from Indian people, and they remembered that support they got from Indian people, from the indigenous people here. And when we went to them and asked them for help, now that they're the senior bureaucrats, okay, they helped us, and they were willing to help us because they said, you helped us when we needed it. We're willing to help you. And so those are the kind of things that happen, but these are long-term kind of relationships, and you have to build a relationship. That's the whole part of successful negotiation, is working on relationships.
Wow, thank you. Thank you so much, Frank.
Thanks.
Sorry, Natalie.
No, go ahead. No, it's okay.
So thank you so much for being here. I really enjoyed your talk. I'm just curious, I know there's been some discussion around reparations. for those who have been victims of environmental injustice. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on reparations and how might they look like?
It's a real complex issue. And in some cases, it's generational. That's the problem is understanding what the full impact has been. Because, people who've lived, I live in a resort area, Harbor Springs. It's a deep water port, a deep water bay off Little Traverse Bay. We can actually get a freighter in here. It's really deep in this area. It's sheltered. It's one of the best bays on all the Great Lakes. And since the 1880s, the railroad came in, and we have had resort homes here, big 30-room houses, okay, along the resort, right along the bay. People have lived there, and the people who lived there were the industrialists from Chicago, Cleveland, Indianapolis. They would send their families north to live in the nice fresh air in the summer. Meanwhile, they're running the factory in the city with the people who can't leave, that are living in all of the smoke and the pollution and all the terrible places. But their families are living up here. And they send their families away for the summer so that they can have fresh air and everything. Well, what is it? Several generations of doing that. How does that affect their family? But how does it then affect those families that can't leave, the ones that have to stay? And what does it mean for how they develop? So when you talk about reparations, it's really hard to determine exactly what that means when it comes to environmental or climate justice, unless you're talking about a specific instance, an incinerator that's causing a particular amount of pollution in a particular area and people affected directly by that area. Reparations in that case are a lot easier to figure out. Okay, what is that? The Aaron Brockovich chemical, I forget the name of it, but Hexa something or other, the whole thing that they did in that big case, it's in that movie. They were able to identify individual people who definitely needed and were able to sue for damages because of the direct effects of that chemical in the environment. The same thing can be said for what's going to happen with some of the PFAS, because there are large houses who built in an area and were using well water. They don't have city water, they have well water. And this big fancy $1 million home is now worth a fraction of that amount because they can't use their water. And they had health issues before they knew they couldn't use it. Reparations in that kind of a case, yes. So environmental reparations are largely due to environmental health damage that can be directly attributed to a particular point. But the sort of generations of inequities that come from environmental injustice because of these things that's a little harder to prove, because so much of society is potentially a beneficiary of it. So I would think that the most effective thing we could do is clean it up so it's not doing it anymore.
Thank you so much.
I'll jump in. Yeah, thank you for that. I really appreciated you sharing everything with us, and just appreciated hearing you speak. My question's kind of a combination of the last two, but sort of thinking of this support and relationships, what are steps that people can be taking to sort of look towards a new future for the environment, looking back to what you were talking about just in terms of the 7 generations, because we've been discussing a lot the individual versus these really large corporations. Really large corporations are producing so much pollutant and poison, and there's a lot of talk of this individual action isn't going to change that, but there is also a lot to learn from what you've shared with us, and also the individual actions that people do take, whether they're like already like culturally ingrained in like generational like learning and like what's been passed down in terms of like sustainability. But yeah, I just kind of wanted to know like what, like from your point of view, like what are steps that can be taken to looking towards like to just like making a difference and like working off of like the work that's already been done.
Well, a first and immediate thing that you can do relative to water is when you brush your teeth, turn the faucet off while you're brushing. Now, if you haven't thought about that yet, if everybody, that seems like a little thing for one person, but if everybody does it, it's millions and millions of gallons of water that's not just running down the drain into a septic, into the treatment plant that's got to be done. It's also not being pumped out of the ground somewhere. And so if everybody were to do that, it's a little tiny thing. But on the other hand, it has huge impacts in terms of the environment. It also has huge impacts in terms of the cost of infrastructure and governance and all of the administration, all of these things. That's just one thing you can do with water. If you know how the climate accord works, the Paris Climate Accord works, it works because every country agrees to a nationally determined contribution that they're going to make to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And that they're going to do this in a way to, they're going to pledge how much they're going to reduce the emission of greenhouse gases that hopefully keeps us with under 1.5 degrees climb as centigrade climb in temperature from pre-industrial times. I think we may already be going to miss that goal, but as low as we can keep it, the better it is. So countries need to do that. And that's where the factories and all these other things are figured into that. And it seems like it's this huge thing. And what can I do personally? Well, I came up with the idea of not only an NDC for a nationally determined contribution, but also an IDC for an indigenously determined contribution. What can we individually do as tribal nations? And so we figured out what we're doing for our tribe. And it's a fairly significant amount that we're able to do, even with just a small facility. But the direct answer to your question is a PDC, a personally determined contribution. So you can determine that you're going to use the stairs instead of the elevator every single time you can. And the amount of electricity that you save by doing that, and the fact that you get more fit, so you're healthier, those all things are combined. So it's a win-win for an individual to take that kind of a personal step. Now, is that a tiny thing compared to this huge problem? It is, but if you make an ethos, a culturally, socially broad ethos of doing that, what happens is that will have an effect. That'll have an effect on the burning of fossil fuels. It'll have an effect on health. It's got all kinds of effects. So the other things you can do for personally determined contribution is, I put it this way. I said, I want to put my life where my mouth is. So in doing that, 2 weeks ago, I made a down payment on a plug-in RAV4, plug-in hybrid RAV4. And this is going to reduce my use of fossil fuels. And, but it's more money than what I thought I would do. And I also have to wait 18 months to get the car. Okay, it's a long time. So in these long-term kind of things, but I decided I needed to do that instead of just, you can't be against those nasty old oil companies drilling and piping oil and everything. You can't be against them if you're going to go and buy gas every time you want to go anywhere. You've got to figure out how to not use the products that they're making, and then they'll stop making them if nobody's buying them. So we have to try to do those kind of things in our lives. And I want to put solar collectors in my backyard. I got a place that's all ready to go. I'm working on trying to set that up. And so these are kind of things you can take in your personal life. And all these little tiny things add up to a bigger picture. I think we have a little bit of time left. I think we have one person yet without a question, hasn't asked a question yet.
Yes. Thank you so much for sharing that and everything you've shared so far. My question involves these 17 principles of environmental justice. How have you seen those applied over time, over your career and building relationships? And have you seen those adjusted or adapted with climate change? Because that's not something specifically addressed within those principles, but might need to be.
Well, I don't think I have a specific answer to your question, but if you look through those, you'll see that the various actions that I've spoken about fit in there all the way through, things that we've done. And what I try to do is make sure that any of the governments that I work with are informed, whether they take any action or not on them is another story, but the idea that you want them to be informed of what they need to do in order to be acting with climate justice. And when I worked with the state of Michigan, we were working on trying to figure out how to make sure that the state was taking action. So for instance, the state developed a process for an environmental and tribal liaison, environmental and tribal liaison within the Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. So we have administrative positions that are there to make these things happen. The state of Michigan just developed a Michigan Healthy Climate Plan with a commission that the governor appointed. I spoke at the rollout of that plan. This is an idea of trying to how to implement all those different points. So what I've seen over the years is that these things are being addressed and looked at and incorporated in some ways. Do I think that we've done a great job? No, but I do think that people are more aware. I think that they're doing more and more as time goes by. And when you guys are in charge, you're going to make sure that they're done. And that's the kind of thing that I look at here is that, my generation has done a lot to help create an environment or platform from which people can speak. We want to make sure that we have people who are educated in the way that can be those speakers and leaders. Because we pray in our ceremonies for our elected and spiritual leaders. And we also pray for the leader that's in each and every one of us, all of us. And we pray that decisions are made, not just with our minds, but with our hearts as well. And I think that's a big part of what we're trying to do here is do things with intent, do things with purpose, and do things with heart, not just intellectualize it, but do it in a very human way. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Frank. I think that is a wonderful note to end on. Thank you to our student panelists. And again, thank you, Frank, for your words and for the reminder to really ground our interconnectedness and efforts in respect for ourselves, each other, and the natural world. And thank you all who attended today for listening, sharing space, curiosity, and purpose to build and sustain some collective action in respect for Mother Earth.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Lauren De Jesus, and I am the Civic Engagement Educator at the UIC Latino Cultural Center. Thank you for joining us for today's Climates of Inequality program. Before we actually get started, there's a few things to keep in mind. First, we want to do a quick access check. Please let us know if our audio is okay. Let us know in the chat. Also, let us know if you are able to access the live caption option by clicking on More and Show Subtitle at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you have any questions about accessibility during the program, please message us and we will guide you through that process. Also, just a reminder, this program will be recorded on Zoom, so I'll pause for you to accept the prompt as you enter the space. As always, please be mindful of the virtual space. Use the chat for comments or questions, and we will try our best to get to them towards the end of the program. And I will also share my screen. And in the spirit of healing, we acknowledge and honor the original peoples of the Chicagoland area, the Three Fires Confederacy, which include the Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwe nations, as well as other tribal nations that know this area as their ancestral homeland, including the Menominee, Honchuk, Miami, Peoria, and Sac and Fox. Further, we recognize that indigenous peoples are the traditional stewards of this land that we now occupy, and acknowledge that this land is the current home to one of the largest urban Native American communities in the United States, and that Native people are part of Chicago's past, present, and future. Finally, to acknowledge is to act, and we encourage everyone to consider the multitude of ways to translate knowledge and thoughts into active support for indigenous peoples and communities locally, nationally, and around the world. Again, thank you so much for joining us today. I will now pass the virtual mic to our Center Director, Dr. Rosa Cabrera.
Thank you, Lauren, and good evening and welcome everyone in this cold day if you are in Chicago. I am Rosa Cabrera, Director of the UIC Rafael Cintrón Ortiz Latino Cultural Center, or better known as the LCC. Thank you for joining us in this virtual space for our Climates of Inequality program. We are excited to present the third season of Climates of Inequality, which has been highlighting local, national, and international leaders working on environmental and climate justice. Guest speakers have been sharing frameworks and solutions to address the disproportionate impacts of climate change and environmental pollution on communities of color, indigenous, Black, low-income earners, and including women, the very old and young, the LGBTQ, disabled, and undocumented communities. These EJ leaders have adopted just transition strategies that aim to transition working families to build thriving economies that provide dignified, beneficial, and ecological sustainable livelihoods, while workers have control over the decisions that affect their families and communities. You can find the previous presentations video in the LCC website. I believe the link is going to be put on the chat. I think we're up to perhaps 8 or 9 presentations by now. Before we start the presentation, a few shout outs of appreciation are in order to our partners, the Humanities Action Lab, where the Climates of Inequality project resides, and organizations, Alianza Americas and Little Village Environmental Justice Organization, better known as El Vejo, for their continuous collaboration with the LCC throughout this project. To our co-sponsors, the UIC Sustainability Fee, Latin American and Latino Studies, Social Justice Initiative, the Department of Anthropology, CIMAS Project, Freshwater Lab, Great Cities Institute, Las Ganas Project, Museums and Exhibition Studies, and Native American Support Program. So you can see how there are many, many people here on campus who are very interested in issues of climate change. Also to the student panelists in my environmental and climate justice class, they are Abigail Lowry, Christopher Gutierrez, Jennifer Corona, Omar Limias, and Lucio. The presentation will be about 30 minutes long, followed by a short conversation between these students and our guest speaker. So today's presentation will focus on how an organization in South Florida is working to build a stronger labor movement for climate change, health, and labor justice, protecting low-wage immigrant workers and families, including agricultural workers, day laborers, and domestic workers. These are vulnerable workers, many undocumented, living in one of the most anti-immigrant states in the country. They faced a host of human rights violations, including exposure to environmental toxics, sexual harassment and gender-based violence, low wages, and the increased consequences of climate change as our planet continues to warm and natural disasters intensify. As we saw with the reckoning of Hurricane Ian recently. Our guest speaker today will talk about some of the human rights abuses the migrant workers continue to bear. A bit of background on our guest speaker, Claudia Navarro, who is the co-executive director at WeCount, a South Dade-based worker center. In this role, Claudia has been working to uplift the working conditions of domestic workers, day laborers, and agricultural workers in South Florida. Her work has included developing leaders, engaging in policy advocacy, and expanding immigrant workers' rights via local partnership. Claudia has worked primarily on issues around wage theft, labor trafficking, and sexual harassment and abuse. She graduated from Florida International University with a bachelor's in economic and women and gender studies. She was born and raised in Miami, and she's of Mexican and Nicaraguan descent. I met Claudia through our mutual work with the Humanities Action Lab in the Climates of Inequality project. And I'm so happy that she agreed to share her time and knowledge with us today. So please join me in welcoming Claudia.
Thank you so much, Rosa, for that warm welcome and B, the framing on our work and what we're doing. I think we're going to get started on a presentation here. So there we are. Excellent. I hope everyone can see the screen okay. And so for this Climates of Inequality conversation, I wanted to center both the work that we're doing and a campaign that I'm gonna dive in deep a little bit about, but predominantly our framing through everything is centering worker voices and the experiences of workers in their workplaces as experts. Next slide, please. Great. And so Rosa gave the context of WeCount, but just to have an overview, WeCount started in 2006. We're a grassroots organization of immigrant workers and families in Florida. Our mission is to build power and leadership of immigrant workers to win dignity and justice in our jobs and our communities. We educate and empower workers to build a fair and more equitable society. We know that as human beings, we all deserve to have dignity and respect, but currently live in a society with many injustices, as Rosa named: poverty, exploitation at work, the cost of housing, and the disproportionate impacts of on our communities of the climate crisis, discrimination against immigrants. As named, Florida is an increasingly anti-immigrant and hostile state. And we know that we have millions throughout the country without legal status. And we know that if we want to eliminate these injustices and build a more a just future for ourselves and our communities and those who follow us, the way to do so is to build grassroots organizations like WeCount, develop the popular consciousness, and take collective action. We know that another world is possible if we are organized. Next slide, please. And so within WeCount, just a little bit of context, we frame it around 6 programs. The first is our campaigns. Second is outreach and education. Third is our community radio station, a low power FM station that plays here in South Dade. Fourth, leadership development, which is crucial to base building. 5, social and legal support for our membership. And 6, political education. And one thing that I didn't name and haven't named is that our membership are comprised of immigrant workers in the agriculture industries, not only food, but horticulture. They beautify our homes. Domestic worker who care for our homes and our loved ones. Construction workers, landscapers, sort of the gamut of outdoor workers. And I'm going to dive into the main campaign that we're running here at WeCount, and also to name that the majority of our membership are either Latinx or indigenous members from mostly Guatemala and Mexico, but all over Central and South America. And we have over 10 languages represented in our membership, from Mam, Ichil, Canjobal, Mixteco, and many others. And so we have a lot of rich diversity in Latin America within our organization, and we do our best to represent those communities. So if we move forward one slide. So to dive in deep, right, we began in 2018 to really figure out what are the issues that are happening in South Florida, particularly in South Dade, when we're talking about outdoor workers. Our focus in this report that we published, which can be found on our website, The Human Landscape, through our campaign Sembrando Justicia, which means planting justice, was about finding the working conditions of plant nurseries within South Miami-Dade County. Since then, we know that our industry for plant nurseries has increased. We have more than 1,500 small to large plant nurseries within the county, and the majority of our membership also come from plant nurseries. We also have one of the largest companies in the largest plant nursery company in the world that is based in Miami-Dade County. And so we know when we're talking about low income farm workers, we're also talking about plant nursery workers. And so this report, which was published in 2018, was critical to our understanding. Through the report and the investigation, we led focus groups, interviews, and listening sessions to find out the working conditions of workers in plant nurseries. Next slide. And so as a result of this work and our collaboration with HAL, we got together with our members and worked through a memory mapping project. And so here we called it WeCount Stories. And I'm going to play a couple minutes of this video that talks really about who our members are and their journeys to get here to the US.
Cuando tú entrabas en cuenta, o sea, tú acuérdate todas las partes del rancho y para nosotros tratar de verlos con tus ojos. O sea, cuando tú ibas al rancho, cómo se veía por afuera, cómo se miraban los árboles verdes, y no entraban carros. No, ahí era caballos. O sea, tenías que entrar al rancho utilizando caballos. Okay. Pero en el rancho donde yo nací, ahí se daban la milpa.
Las plantas.
No, las plantas, pero que se dio milpas. Entonces, pues, calurosa. Bueno, yo vengo de una tierra fría, sí, fría, en donde se cosecha papa, en donde se cosecha todo relacionado a lo que son los vegetales, la lechuga, el repollo, la zanahoria, el whisky, y podías ver las montañas o...
Sí, lo que más adoraba ver por las mañanas es salir al patio de mi casa, ver el hermoso sol que brilla entre dos cerros. Mi casa estaba encima está encima de una loma, y en donde hay dos cerros, que uno se dirige hacia allá y el otro se dirige acá, y el sol sale reluciéndose en medio de esas dos montañas, y yo puedo ver la hermosura del amanecer. Es lo que más extraño de Guatemala, mi casa, mis amigos, más que todo mi mamá, a mis hermanos. Y son tantas cosas que son inolvidables de Guatemala para mí.
Sí, sí, eso. Vine a este país porque tenía dos niñas. Tuve mi niña a los...
Thank you. So it's a 10-minute long video. I encourage those that have the time to go back and listen to the stories that our members shared back in 2019. But I wanted to share the small clip of this video because we know that people come to the US for better opportunities, not because they don't love their countries or they don't love their communities. And so part of the work that we do here is once they come over here, what are the conditions that they're being that they're being exposed to, the exploitation, the dangerous working conditions, the exploitation of wage theft. And so as part of the project that we did with HAL and the university, Florida International University, students interviewed our members. And you saw in some of the footage there, drew out what our members told them, right? What their stories of migration, why they came here, and what are the impacts of what that migration did to them and continues to affect them. So if we can move to the next slide. And so they also created a website that allows you to jump through the different stories in a visual manner. And so they created these videos, this website, and pamphlets for workers to be able to take on. And so, you know, as part of our tradition in organizing, understanding that worker stories are essential to understanding who workers are and what motivates them. And so throughout this process, we were able to connect with workers and learn about their conditions of migration and their experiences on the job. And so if you want to switch to the next slide. And so you see here with Elcida's story, we can see what her community was like in her country of origin, and then what her process was, knowing that oftentimes it's a gruesome and dangerous migration. And so we were able to get a little bit of that with our collaboration with both HAL and with FIU. Next slide. And we were able to print out these booklets that also allowed the workers to take home their stories and what they shared. This is the first few pages of the story of Juan and Marta that were particularly important. And so if we switch to the next slide. Thank you. All of that work from Sembrando Justicia to the Climates of Inequality project collaboration that we did with HAL allowed us to get to this point. All the stories, listening sessions, focus groups allowed us to get to the point to launch our Que Calor campaign, which launched in June of last year. And so I'm going to walk through what that campaign is and what our workers are fighting for here in South Florida. There should be sound to that.
1 second.
Yo trabajo en el campo, en la agricultura, y nos levantamos a las 4 a.m. todos los días. Antes de las 7 o a las 7 ya estoy en mi trabajo, pero el transcurso de cómo va aumentando la calor, el cuerpo va resintiendo. Como uno anda agachado y todo eso pega el rayo del sol en la espalda. Aunque yo cargo siempre mi carro para ayudar al riñón, pero llegó el momento que ya no resistieron. Me meto debajo de la camioneta porque sombra sí no hay. Sí, necesito pintar mi casa. ¿Pintar mi casa? Sí. ¿Cuánto pago por hora? 11.
En una ocasión estaba yo en una escalera pintando y hacía un calor bastante intenso. Perdí el control y caí de la escalera de un segundo piso y eso me pasó a raíz de la intensidad del calor.
Mire, en el campo, todas las verduras, ¿quién lo hace eso? ¿Quién lo trabaja eso? Somos nosotros los inmigrantes, ¿verdad? Si no hay personas que trabajan, pues no hay comida para las demás personas. Y ahí no puedes buscar una sombra, ¿verdad? En las nurserías no lo dan protección a los trabajadores. Ahí sí uno tiene que ir preparado, ¿verdad? Con su camisa de manga larga, con su sombrero. La propuesta ahora es lograr una ley para dar una protección hacia los trabajadores del campo.
Agua, sombra y descanso. Eso es lo que estamos pidiéndole.
Si el gobierno lo aprueba esa ley, va a todos los emigrantes, a todos los trabajadores. Si no vamos a organizar, si no nos vamos a levantar a exigir, y entonces, ¿quién lo va a hacer?
¡Qué calor!
Hay veces quedamos sin agua y nosotros queremos el agua porque ahora hay mucho calor.
Thank you. So I think there was a little bit of a lag in the video. So if you want to go back and watch it, feel free to. It's on our website, we-count.org. But just to run through and give a little bit of structure for the rest of this conversation, I'm going to be running through the campaign. We did a little bit of pre-campaign history, talking about the strategic assessments and opportunities, what our timeline has been, and what desde abajo, from the bottom up, is our model and vision for the campaign. And so I also wanted to name, as we see here, the disproportionate impact that that extreme heat is going to continue to have on outdoor workers. We, in the video, saw the figures of how much the days above 100 degrees are going to increase in the next decades as a result of the climate crisis. And so we understand that the climate crisis is not happening in decades from now, it's happening today. And so what are we doing to adapt to the current conditions? And we have taken within our campaign and have learned from organizations in Washington State, in California, in Texas, as well as what are other countries doing across the world to mitigate the effects of extreme heat. We know that yearly in the county, in Miami-Dade County, over 34 workers die to extreme heat. And we also know that it is extremely underreported and very little tied or not often tied to exposure at the workplace. So if someone shows up at the ER and they're experiencing heat illness symptoms, it will often not be attached to their specific workplace, but broader conditions. And we also know that the social determinants of health that vastly and disproportionately impact Black and Brown people in our country, like health impacts like diabetes, high blood pressure, make it that much more difficult for those workers who have those pre-existing conditions in their workplaces when they're not provided basic and common sense protections. And so that's what our campaign about, is providing basic and common sense protections of water, shade, and rest to outdoor workers in Miami-Dade County. And I'm going to jump into a little bit about what that means and how we're looking to win that campaign in this next slide. And so all of this work came with several assessments. The first is that there are limits to the federal and state strategy of passing laws that often many believe will trickle down and have a blanket protection to workers. We know often that's not the case. We have to continue to stress the importance of what we are calling pre-enforcement in worker leadership and participation, because we understand that passing an amorphous law that also has no enforcement mechanism doesn't actually protect anyone if workers are not involved and are educating themselves and training other workers in their workplaces and their communities. The third assessment is that we know we have to build a popular narrative on extreme heat and build a cross-sector coalition. This conversation is centered a little bit on climate as it is extreme heat, but we understand that there is an impact to public health, that it's an impact on labor and climate. And so how do we begin to make these the word that's coming to me is enlaces, these threads across different sectors in our social justice movement, to have them understand that the topic of extreme heat and workers impacts them too. And then the fourth is understanding that the misconception that the climate crisis is something to worry about in the next few decades, understanding that what workers are experiencing today at their workplaces is a vehicle to bring in workers for long-term organizing on climate issues and bringing them into the fold. Next slide. And so here we have several pictures on that I'm going to walk through on activities and things that we've done. The first thing is, we know that it is crucial to building leaders as leaders continue to build the organizations and bring in more workers from their workplaces and communities. And so here we have examples of how we have workers integrated in our meetings and our workshops, and how we use listening sessions and focus groups led by other workers as tools to both building the base, but building leadership skills. Next slide. And so in both of these pictures, one, as you can see, it's a late night meeting that we have. Oftentimes we meet when workers are available. That means in the evenings or on the weekends. And so here we have a listening session where we're broken down into small groups talking about, and this is one of our early campaign meetings that we had last year, where we began to bring the topic of extreme heat and the impact on their workplaces with our members. And then the next picture, and I'll talk about this in a further slide, is recruitment that our workers committed to for an assembly where we were preparing to publicly launch the campaign. And so here everybody is fired up to start recruiting for that assembly. Next slide. And here we have a couple of examples on what's critical in bringing in new people from the community and from workplaces is outreach. And so we have our organizer there, Eric, doing outreach to day labor corners. And day laborers, for those that don't know, are immigrant workers, typically men, that solicit work outside of big box home improvement stores like Home Depots and Lowe's. And in South Dade, given that it is an agricultural heavy community, a lot of the workers that are picked up to do work in these communities are not necessarily just like landscaping and residential construction, but it's often plant nursery work and food agriculture jobs. And so this is him doing outreach in the mornings between 6 and 8 before workers are contracted. And so then we also have farm work outreach and one of our members doing outreach to his community and to workers that he knows. Next slide. As part of our recruitment process, we also had workers, our members, go out and sign pledge cards. To date, we have collected more than 1,000 pledge cards of workers who are committed and who believe in the campaign for water, shade, and rest. Next slide. And critical to the work that we're doing is educating workers both on their rights at the workplace, but how to recognize extreme heat symptoms of heat illness, heat stroke. And so one of those pictures was an 8-hour day-long training session, train the trainers so that workers can become experts and train other workers in their workplace on extreme heat illness and its symptoms. And so those are several pictures that we had from that day. And we have continued to do workshops on extreme heat throughout the entire campaign process. Next slide. And as I mentioned before, here are several pictures of listening sessions. What I haven't named up to this point is our campaign, which is worker-led. Every single process has been intentional. And so in this year-long trajectory of the campaign, worker input is not only necessary, it is crucial. And so part of the demands that we eventually put in the legislation that we are advocating for within Miami-Dade County, all of the decisions that were made were done with workers. And so one of these listening sessions is talking through what the heat index should be when we're starting to regulate. What does it mean to have cool, clean, potable water? How far away and how accessible should it be? Within a how minute walk does it need to be? What does a shaded structure look like in your current workplace? And how do we have those structures duplicated and implemented in other workplaces? And so this is, again, examples of how we're using worker expertise to both inform the campaign, but inform our legislation. Next slide. And as I mentioned, the heat assembly, which was in September of last year, was when we publicly launched the campaign. We had over 100 workers join us in historic downtown Homestead. And we had the first chief heat officer join us, as well as public health officials and government officials who came and both lended their support, but also continued to educate the workers. And we got promises from those folks on continuing to be involved in the campaign. And so it was, I think, historic by many means, and also a day of a lot of celebration. We had mariachi there for lunch. And so as part of our campaign activities, understanding that workers' voices and culture is 100% crucial to moving forward the campaign. Next slide. And so this is a picture of us going to a BCC local Board of County Commissioner meetings right before the legislative session of this year for the Miami-Dade state legislators to get support on statewide heat legislation. And I'll talk a little bit moving forward about how that strategy didn't pan out, but again, advocacy being crucial to the work that we're doing. Next slide. And desde abajo, from bottom up. And so next slide, please. One of the things that, and I'll talk a little faster because I know I'm running a little short on time. But one of the things that we have seen that is 100% necessary to moving forward this campaign is knowing that workers need to be involved at every stage of the process, and knowing that there are 3 levels of government in which we can potentially impact workers' workplaces. And so starting from the top, earlier this year, Biden announced an OSHA rulemaking process on extreme heat. And so knowing that it was announced, late last summer, knowing that the process for beginning an OSHA rulemaking process from beginning to end can be 6 to 8 years, and knowing that though these protections are coming across federally in 6 to 8 years, knowing that today workers are dying from extreme heat, and that is a timeline that we can't wait. And so moving forward with a local solution. Next slide. And so in previous years, we had a state strategy in introducing state legislation. And so we introduced language, did legislative advocacy, and we made strategic assessments that bill was actually not going to be transformative enough to make an impact on workers, given that it was largely a messaging bill and it had no enforcement, and knowing that for workers to have real protections, they need enforcement in their workplaces. Next slide. And so that brings us to Miami-Dade County, where we made the strategic pivot in not focusing on a federal approach or a state approach, but knowing that our legislation here can actually be a template, if one, for heat standards across the country, right? And so there were issues in thinking creatively on how to implement, oh no, back one slide. Yeah, on how to implement a local legislation, and how in the current local political context that we have potential paths to move forward. And so we decided throughout the campaign to continue to move on a local strategy to win a countywide standard for extreme heat. And so that is the last of the slides. And I know I have left out a lot, but I know we're at 30 minutes and I'm sure we have a couple of questions. But I just want to leave it with, if you are interested in getting to know and being involved with our campaign, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, our website, and we now have a TikTok. We're trying to be trendy. So follow us, and on our website, we also have great coverage of the work that we've done. Earlier this summer, we were featured very excitedly by the Washington Post. And so, yeah, I'll pause there. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Claudia. I see that folks are clapping. Thank you for sharing your work and really the strategy to the campaigns that you're working on. To echo folks in the chat, the second video that you shared was extremely moving. And now with the remaining time, I think we have about 15 minutes. I'd like to invite the student panelists to share questions and thoughts that they have with you. And everyone else who is joining us, please continue to add any thoughts or questions that you want to share with Claudia via the chat or the Q&A feature. Any of the students, please take it away.
Hi, I'll take it away. First of all, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your information with us. So I guess my question is, what is the next phase of your project? And are you guys still continuing to push for federal legislation as well as the local legislation, or kind of what's in store for the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. And so I'm really excited that in September, we were invited to participate with leaders across the country to an OSHA Workers Voices Summit, where we had the ear of Department of Labor and OSHA broadly staff. And so we talked about the process of the rules making that they have. And like I mentioned, it is a 6 to 8 year process. And so again and again, we had worker testimonies and we were able to bring a couple workers up with us to Washington for this summit. And we were able to communicate with them, I think, effectively on how this process cannot wait 6 to 8 years. And so we actually were able to be in communication and in a small focus group with one of the staffers that is actually leading that process within OSHA. And so part of our advocacy is not to throw away any sort of level of government, but to say we're hyper focusing on one because we believe that that is the best strategy to transform workplaces in Miami-Dade County, and how we use that template that we're moving here in South Florida to be able to be moved and used in other places across the country as we continue to advocate for a federal standard.
Thank you so much.
How you doing? I have a question for you, Claudia Navarro. One of the questions, I have a couple of them, but I'll just pick the one that I'm most intrigued in. Claudia Navarro, have you, do you know anybody, any other organization that is doing as much work as you are doing for Latino migrant workers? Like, is there other organizations that are as like invested as you are? And what's your like desired goal at the end?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. I mentioned earlier, a lot of the work that we're doing is not in a vacuum. We are learning from experts across the country, like Workers Defense Project in Texas, organizations in California and Washington State. And so we know that across the country, there are other organizations that are also focusing on immigrant workers, particularly on the issue of extreme heat, but on workers' issues and immigrant issues broadly. And what was the second part of that question?
Oh, and the second part was that who else is like doing as much as you are doing with you know, working against like environmental injustices? And then what the second part was that how were you able to get so many people to trust you? Like, how were you able to get like these people to trust you and be like, I'm gonna tell my story, and like to record them, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think and that reminded me, I think what you said our goal was. Our goal is to get to the thousands of immigrant workers in Miami-Dade County, and hopefully beyond that, right? Our short to midterm goal is thousands of workers in Miami-Dade County. In Miami, about 60% of our population is immigrants, right? It's, you know, you come here and people don't say we're Florida, Miami is a whole different country in and of itself. And so, you know, that I think is our first goal. I think second is knowing that that we have been in the community for over 15 years and that workers have the right to express themselves, and the empowerment that comes from sharing your story and taking ownership of the experiences, and also saying, this happened to me and I'm getting involved because I don't want it to happen to anyone else. And I think that is a line that we hear time and time and again. And I hadn't mentioned, right, but one of the workers that you saw in the video, Jose Delgado, is a sweet potato farmer in his 70s that in 2017 actually experienced, as he named, heat stroke, right? And that was one of the first moments of one of our longtime members experiencing something like heat stroke that we were aware of. And so that is what ultimately began our path to forming Que Calor, right? And hearing from other workers. And so part of the work that we're doing is crucial to hear from workers, because it's not as impactful for me to sit here and say, oh, this happens to an amorphous number of people, but that real workers, real people are experiencing this today. And so yes, he is okay. He recovered from his heat stroke, and unfortunately actually did experience heat illness earlier this year again, right? And so we know that it doesn't necessarily just happen to you once and you learn how to protect yourself. If workers don't have protections at their workplaces, it can continue to happen to them. But thank you for your question.
All right, thank you so much, Claudia. Thank you.
Hi, Claudia. I have a question for you too in regards to COVID-19 and the working conditions of the agricultural workers. I was wondering, have there been any measures in place, like locally and federal and state, regards, like in regards for agricultural workers to breathe in better quality air?
Yeah, I would say in Florida, which as named is an increasingly anti-immigrant state and actually sides more often on the side of employers than it does with workers, there haven't been any broad protections that I know of when it comes to the quality of air in the workplace. I know that part of the work that we did early on in the pandemic was ensuring that immigrants and immigrant workers had access to both vaccination and to testing. We know early on that there was ID requirements that a lot of our communities did not have and continue to not have. And so we did advocacy to expand access to those things. And early on, we did have a mutual aid fund, knowing that a lot of the majority of immigrant workers in the county were being left out without any protections or stimulus. So we started that mutual aid program.
Hi, Claudia. Gracias for being here. First of all, for setting time aside and sharing your work, your labor. That's very important. And for me, it's important because I come from grandparents who were once braceros. So this idea of connecting labor and climate justice is really important and interesting for other folks to see the interlinks, right, with those two ideas. But I do have a question for you, slightly two-part question. So how would you define intersectional environmental justice or climate justice? And how has this intersectional praxis developed over your time, your trajectory as an organizer, a community member? You can note any changes as well in this praxis that you have built.
Wow, that's a really big question. So how would I define, can you say that one more time? Intersectional?
Yes, intersectional environmental justice.
Intersectional environmental justice. And so I think I named it earlier. Workers, immigrants, Black and Brown people are disproportionately impacted by the effects of the climate crisis. And so I think part of our work is understanding why they're disproportionately impacted, what are the conditions of their homes and their workplaces, and then their lives generally that puts people in the situations to be disproportionately impacted when we're talking about in the environment and when we're talking about the climate crisis. And so for us, that's understanding folks' gender identity, their immigration status, their working conditions, their workplaces, their income. And so as some of the determinants in understanding why people are being impacted by the climate crisis. And so we see that often in the work that we're doing. It's Latinx, Mayan indigenous in our community particularly. It's a mix of men, women, and often now youth that are immigrating and coming to South Florida to do plant nursery work. And, I'm not talking about 18, 19, 20-year-olds. I'm talking about 14, 15, 16-year-old youth that are coming to this country to, provide for their families. And so I think thinking about all of those issues all together, and also thinking about if they're experiencing extreme heat today at their workplaces, what are also the long-term impacts of experiencing extreme heat disproportionately without protections, and understanding the compounding effects of, as I mentioned, right? What does it mean when a worker doesn't have access to healthy and clean food, right? And so how that impacts their physical health, and how that then combines with their workplace and all the compounding issues. So I hope that made sense.
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all for asking those questions to Claudia and for your response, Claudia. I see that in the chat, we only have a couple of minutes left. There's a question here that says, what was it like working with farm workers themselves? Has there been any resistance to the sort of the strategic proposals or the campaigns that you've brought forth?
Yeah, I think I love that question, mostly because I think it reminds me of the resistance that we're facing as a society to get people to care about climate change or the climate crisis, right? And so the same issues that we see within the broader society, we also experience with farm workers. A lot of the times, they don't necessarily see the climate crisis as urgent issues because the most urgent issue is working and providing for their families, right? And so how do we get workers to care about the compounding issues of extreme heat and the climate crisis when they're worried about feeding their families today? And so and in combination, the normalization of extreme heat. We're in Miami. There's almost sort of the understanding that it's always going to be hot. And so what's the baseline normal hot that people experience, and the disproportionate extreme heat where every single year we're experiencing more days over 100 degree heat index. And so I think it's an interesting question to figure out, and it's an organizing question. How do we get workers to care about issues? And so I think we do it by listening to workers and by figuring out what motivates them and what are the issues that they're facing at their workplace, and having them understand that issues that they're facing aren't individual to themselves, but are actual part of the structural condition, and that their workplaces are designed that way on purpose. And so how do we collectivize to organize ourselves to make sure that we can transform our workplaces and our communities?
Thank you, Claudia. I think we have a chance for maybe one more question. Rosa, would you like to say your question? Or I can read it. Okay. The question here is that migrant workers, many of whom don't have immigration papers or legal status, are now involved in the storm recovery, cleaning up the damage caused by Hurricane Ian, yet they don't qualify for relief. Is there a strategy to address their invisible labor in this movement?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. oftentimes we refer to day laborers as second responders, because we understand that they are often the folks that when it comes to disaster resiliency and recovery are often on the second line, right? You have your emergency responders that come first to sort of evacuate folks that are in dangerous home conditions, and then second, when it comes to the recovery, they're being pulled in. And so yes, I think part of what our work is coordinating with other local organizations and national organizations that are thinking strategically about how to both educate workers on safe and healthy workplaces, and to prevent accidents from happening, because we know that when it comes to rapid response, there may not be the same health and safety concerns that might be in a traditional workplace. And so part of the work that we're doing and being involved in conversations is how we educate workers before extreme weather events like Hurricane Ian happen. But I think part of the other question that I'm seeing in Rosa's question is the not being able to qualify for relief. And I think part of the response is for community organizations to build mutual aid networks to be able to fill in those gaps, understanding that the government should actually be responsible for that, for the workers who go out and cultivate our food, and to be left out of disaster response. And so I think part of that is both an immigration question and an immigration reform question about how we get folks within the system, but what we're doing in the short term. And yeah, I think in summation, we're trying to figure it out.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Claudia. There were a few other questions we won't have the chance to get to, but we'll share them with you after. It was sort of around the gender identity of workers and the impact that has on them, and the organizing, and sort of the thoughts you have around language access when it comes to organizing with bilingual or non-English speakers. And so we'll leave that, we'll plant that seed for now. But again, we're at time. So thank you, Claudia, for your talk. Thank you for sort of these reminders of how workers are experiencing the climate crisis today. And in part, as you said, that their workplaces are a vehicle to bring these workers in for long-term organizing on these climate issues. In the chat, someone wrote such intentional and powerful work. And so I just want to echo all of the flowers that folks are sending your way. And thank you again to all the student panelists and everyone who shared space and curiosity and purpose with us today. Our next and final Climates of Inequality presentation is scheduled for Tuesday, November 15th from 5 to 6 p.m., where we'll have California-based guests from the Central Valley Agroecology Program sharing their work. And so please join us for that. You can register via the LCC website, where you can also find the recording of this presentation and previous Climates of Inequality presentations. That brings our program to a close. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great evening, everyone.